All right, so let me ask you something real quick. What do you think is the most iconic electric guitar ever played, and why do you think it holds that title? I think if someone were to ask me that question, I don't really know how I would answer. I mean, there's so many to choose from B.B. King's Lucille to Jimi Hendrix's Monterey Pop to Carlos Santana's PRS. But even amongst those big guns, there's always been one or two that just very clearly stick out amongst the pack. And one of those happens to be John Frusciante's legendary 62 vintage Strat. Now, there's about 12 million things that make that guitar special, right? From the tricolor sunburst to the relic job that's been done over the years to the countless hits that have been written on that guitar for decades and decades and decades. But even within the context of all of those things, I really do think that there's something just different about the idea of a vintage Strat, and knowing that even though I love a lot of my modern day guitars like my American Professional series, there was something just a little bit different about the way that they were built back in the day. And as someone who's currently in the thick of learning about gear, I'm kind of desperate to find out what that actually is. Now, my first most basic instinct would be I gotta get my hands on one of these things, but my mind and my previous experience in the guitar world reminds me that you can't just really walk into any old pawn shop and be like, "Sir, I request your finest 62 vintage Strat." So obviously I gotta find other options and other alternatives. And as happens with a lot of my most creative times, an idea actually starts to form in my head. And weirdly enough, it actually has a lot to do with a jazz master, but trust me, it'll all make sense. Just let me explain. You see, about 6 months ago, I wanted to dive headfirst into the world of offset guitars for the first time to see why people like them and what actually made them so special. So I did once I got my first ever jazz master. Now, this was sort of a twofold victory for me, not only because I finally got to discover the guitar that makes indie kids go crazy, but also because for the first time I was able to witness Fender's American Vintage series, something that I'd heard people talk about for over a year non-stop before I could finally get my hands on one. In the moment, simply because of the anticipation that had been rising over finally trying a jazz master in real time for the first time, I realized that I cared much more about the aspect of diving into the world of offsets for the first time than I did about finding out what made the American Vintage different than any of the other American Fenders that had come out over the years. But that would all definitively change once this guy came in. So real quick, let me show you. Now, as you probably could have guessed, this guy, much like my Strat, is of the American Vintage series, more specifically the American Vintage 61 Strat. Now, Fender's big claim in making these reissues is that they made them as close to the vintage style 60s guitars as possible. And since in doing my research, I found there's not an absurd amount of difference between a vintage 61 Strat and like the 62 that Frusciante would play. I thought it would be a really cool insight into what actually made those guitars so absurdly acclaimed. And it all really starts with the neck. You see, what I didn't know beforehand is that a lot of what gives certain Fenders that vintage feel is the specific radius on the neck. In a lot of the modern Strats, you're going to be expecting a much flatter neck, anything from 9.5 inches all the way up to say 12 in some of their more modern player series. But a neck radius like this, 7.25 inches, I actually haven't seen outside of my Silver Sky on any modern Fenders outside of say like the custom shops nowadays. Now, the next thing is the finish, which actually brings me a little bit back to the Frusciante thing, because originally I was just trying to match the color of his with the tricolor sunburst. However, the more I looked into it, the more I learned that a lot of what makes the vintage Strats different from a lot of the Strats that are coming out today is that they actually used a nitrocellulose lacquer on the finish as opposed to the polyurethane that you'll see in a lot of modern Strats. Now, for those of you like me who didn't know, that is a very big deal. Nitro finishes were very popular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they tend to relic better. So to have that in a guitar that's not a custom shop nowadays, this is very significant. Now, it will take me years and years to get that to Frusciante levels of natural relicking, but we can speed up that process and we can try. Wait, I'm kidding. I would never do that because I would end up smashing the pickups. And much like the finish on this guitar, they happen to be quite unique. You see, these are the pure vintage 61 Strat single coil pickups. And here's where it gets really interesting because I have almost zero context for what a 60 style pickup is even supposed to sound like. So let's find out together. See, what I want to do is test these pickups against something I'm more familiar with, say my Texas Specials, and you just tell me what you hear. getting a gauge of the sound of this sort of Strat versus some of the more modern iterations that I've found not only reminded me of how different the standard changes have been over the years, but also just how much general associations have changed in terms of who made a specific guitar famous. A lot of the time, my mind tends to lead towards emulating some of the more modern Strat players that I grew up trying to emulate, and for me, those would be the Nile Rodgers, the Stevie Ray Vaughns, and even more recently, someone like Frusciante, who we were just talking about. But I think seeing more and more guitars trying to emulate both that vintage look and that era's design, it reminded me that there was probably a legitimate expectation change between someone in the 60s getting a Strat like a George Harrison versus someone less than 30 years later like a Stevie Ray Vaughan, and both are Strat players. And how for the individual like you and me, even that can change. I mean, when I first started playing guitar, I thought that the big 70s headstocks on the Strats were the coolest things that I had ever seen. And a lot of that is simply because that's what came stock on the American special models that were really big in the American entry-level Fenders when I first started playing. I mean, nowadays, I definitively prefer the more traditional headstocks, and I think a lot of that comes from subconsciously watching some of those guys who were my heroes from the 60s with those same style of headstocks. You know, like a Rory Gallagher in the late 60s, or a Clapton technically in 70, or even Hendrix in 67 playing Purple Haze, which was actually what I was jamming to most recently. So fuzz 60 Strat into my actual amp, very different from my usual setup, but like, what more could you ask for? I know it's technically not a 60s riff, but we have to do it because it's like top 5 in my book. So. So you're probably sitting here thinking what I'm thinking, which is, Mike, what's the point of all this? And I think it's more than just saying that all Strats are different, but I think to say that it's all about finding those little differences that a lot of the times we take for granted between Strats that end up adding up to really big things that make those different iterations of Strats seem like completely different instruments that eventually inspire us to play completely different things. I think with it having been the 70th anniversary of the Strat this year, I wanted to see a couple of those that they've made over the years, and more specifically with the American Vintage 2 series, to see just how they're trying to really recreate everything for the modern player to maybe experience what made their heroes love those guitars so much back in the day, and just in general over the years. And I think once you start to think about it, that's a really cool thing, with even for me specifically, having wanted to play an American Vintage 2 for so long after getting my American Professional, it seems like a really fascinating moment that piqued my interest into where Fender will be going in the future. And I think all of this just in general sparks a lot of curiosity on taking it one step further with these details and finding out for myself what made the 70s Strats different than the 60s Strats, what made people absolutely adore some of the Japanese Strats back in the day, and see what details really help form my opinion into finally figuring out what I might think is the greatest era of Strat. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know, what do you think is like the definitive era of the Strat, and what do you think are the details that actually made it that way? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. Like I said, with it having been the 70th anniversary of the Strat, and having always wanted to check out the American Vintage 2 series since it came out over a year ago, this feels very surreal and very cool. If you want to know anything more about this Strat in particular, Sweetwater has been hooking it up with both this and the SRV Signature. The links are in the description. Make sure to check them out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I use today, i.e. pedals, amps, or in any of the other videos. Make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to my patrons. If you want to check it out, there's some cool extra stuff on there. The links are below. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, most important of all, have the most fan-strat-tastic day of your life. Yeah, dude, I made it through a whole Strat video without mayor simping. I think it's a new era.